my focus this morning is on war, but photography, photojournalism, and not necessarily war photography because that's not what I focus on in my everyday career, but it is a big chunk of what I do, and conflict. Not just conflict in the conventional sense of how we think about conflict, but also conflicts surrounding a war, for example. The internal conflicts of, just thinking outside the box of what we normally think of as a conflict. This all sounds very confusing, but I'll get there. So when I was asked to do this talk around the theme of fantasy, I was thinking of how fantasy actually applies to our everyday lives and also in photojournalism and news. So a lot of us, take personal pictures for Instagram, for Facebook, and, for example, we'll sit in a cafe and we'll take a picture of our latte. But all around that latte is just a mess of paper, tissues and whatever, but we, with technology, we're able to edit out the stuff that we don't want to show. And that is a portrayal of what, is the kind of fantasy that we want to show people around us to say, hey, we're having a really beautiful coffee spread this morning, whatever. In the same vein, how fantasy applies to photojournalism is the alternate side. So the subjects that I document and photograph portray their own fantasy in the sense that the lives that they live, in particular the ones that have gone through dictatorship and such, they have an alternate kind of reality to the one that I'm used to or that we're used to. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, how I started, and also focusing on 3 particular countries in my generation of news, which is the Arab Spring and now to Iraq, the war against ISIS, for example. I'm just going to, I'm going to keep it very casual, so if anybody wants to jump in with a question at any point, feel free to do so. So this was taken in Libya in the beginning of 2011. It was the start of the Arab Spring. Tunisia, Egypt, the governments had fallen there, and we thought, or the journalists thought, that Libya would follow in the same vein. And I arrived about a week after the revolution in Libya started. A lot of anti-government sentiment poured out onto the streets. They overthrew the government's control in the eastern city of Benghazi. And people were out on the streets in masses and praying. This was the Friday prayer, the first Friday prayer, outside of the courthouse, protesting the fall of the Gaddafi government, the Gaddafi regime. And how fantasy applied to this particular country was really interesting to me because I don't know how many of you know what was going on in Gaddafi's government before the fall, but he had reigned for 42 years over this country with an iron fist. And it was this very bizarre world in which Gaddafi was ultimately the ruler. He had say over everything. And he created this very bizarre place for himself where, even his palaces, which I saw after the fall of the government in Tripoli, was, super luxurious. The government had pocketed a lot of the country's oil wealth. And ultimately, the people were left with nothing, no freedom of speech, no real government or political institutions or even non-governmental institutions that were not closely controlled by the government. So there was no basis really for a democracy, which is why a lot of people were at a loss of what to do. They just knew freedom for the first time. And ultimately descended very quickly into a war between opposition forces, rebels as we called them, and government troops who continued to remain loyal to the Gaddafi government. This was the first day of the actual conflict. I remember going to the front line, or what we thought was the front line, with rebels commandeering these tanks and shooting guns into the air for the first time. This was not a trained force by any means. Many of them were civilians, doctors, teachers, students, tailors, who one day were living a normal life and the next day fighting a war. And in this way, they were casting off this, the world of Gaddafi, and then entering their own world, in which one that they were trying to make on their own. So it became a very, very intense and very violent one. I was witnessing also for the first time my own conflict, which a lot of people were becoming civilians one day, soldiers the next, and contending with those emotions of how they turned on one against another, so Libyan against Libyan. Also, there were a lot of migrants caught up in this conflict. And this was really, again, as I mentioned, the start of my career in conflict photography. So I was really at a loss for how to portray this. So a lot of what I did was both quiet moments and also the direct conflict of how it affected. I tried to do both sides, but it was impossible to. These were actually dead government soldiers. And just the impact it had on people's lives, essentially. So does anybody have any questions? Just as you can tell, I'm a little bit nervous. But ultimately, I think what I want to do is portray the reality. How do I connect the reality of a war like this to bring it back home to newspapers and people who read the news? It's pretty difficult, and it's very bizarre in a lot of ways, because how do you convey the feelings of war and make it as immediate to people so that they understand what ultimately they are going through? He was he was a captured Gaddafi fighter. And this was also, again, on the front lines where a lot of the rebels, no understanding of international law or whatever, were taunting them. A lot of people got tortured. But I also felt that this was important to record because I couldn't get to the government side. It was impossible for a lot of journalists to get visas to go to the Gaddafi side. So I stayed mostly on the rebel side. And again, that was like a whole reality unto itself, where I tried not to make propaganda for people. At the same time, I had to portray the reality. When I was covering Libya, it was, maybe some of you are interested in how photojournalism works or freelance photography works. It was pretty, I actually bought my own plane ticket to go to Egypt and then ultimately to Libya. The news industry is just collapsed, and it's really hard to get work as a freelancer, but not that I would encourage anybody to do this now. This is how my career started, and I met a lot of writers and other photographers there who were willing to help out a young freelancer and ultimately get, move forward with the work that I was doing. At the end of the Gaddafi regime, it created another whole set of issues for the country. Again, the reality is changing, where at first there was a lot of hope and euphoria of being able to, of having thrown off the government that had ruled for 42 years and having freedom of speech, but not everybody knew what to do with that, and ultimately became, has descended even further into a very complicated situation where nobody has any control anymore, and everybody with a gun believes that they wield some kind of power. The next country that I focused on after Libya was Syria. It was much the same situation in the beginning, where people rose up against the government of Bashar al-Assad and descended into an awful, awful civil war, which has killed over 600,000 people. And what I found there was another kind of fantasy. People's lives were upended completely, but yet they became more religious, more believing in their God, despite the extreme circumstances they were living through. So it's like, you go from living under a dictatorship where basically 1 in 4 people there were informants for the government, having no freedom of speech, no real prospects or ability to get into politics unless you were a family member of somebody who was already in the government, and then fighting a war of freedom for many of them, and latching onto something such as religion to be able to keep that going. So, people were becoming a lot more religious despite these awful things that they were witnessing. I was in Aleppo, which is Syria, or was Syria's largest city. It had a population of about, I think, 2 million people before the war. And I remember walking on the streets with civilians in the neighborhoods that were protesting against Bashar al-Assad. And just, again, the same feeling of being in Libya, euphoric, people just wild-eyed and wondering what to do with their newfound freedom, what they would do. Would they be able to create government institutions on their own? Would they be able to move forward and have democratic elections? There were just so many things flying around in the air. People were trying to figure out a path for themselves, and everybody wanted something different, too. But sadly, obviously, that's not happened over the last 5 years, and everybody's hopes have been dashed. This was one of the pictures that I took in the middle of Aleppo, where the opposition neighborhoods that had rose up against the government or the president just sank into darkness. At night, there was no electricity. A lot of times there were water outages, and it was this eerie kind of feeling of being in an apocalypse, where you could see when you climbed up onto a building, the government section having full light, full power, and then the opposition neighborhoods having it would completely plunge into darkness. And that was such an important metaphor for what was coming. I covered a lot of the effects on the civilian population, particularly in Aleppo and in another province to the west. And what I witnessed was really, horrific is just an understatement. But I tried as much as possible to stay with civilians, to witness what they were going through, and try to, again, portray that to the international media and try to make people care. And it was really tough because it was such a faraway conflict, especially for Americans, I think. And the Syrians were often asking me why the US wasn't engaging or helping or intervening in some way. I never had a good answer, but it was very tough to see a lot of innocent people have to pay the heaviest price. Syria's just become a complete wasteland. I don't think you could find a house that's still standing, especially in opposition neighborhoods, which have been bombarded on a daily basis for the last 5 years, or the last 4 years. And there have obviously been grave consequences, people becoming more radicalized, the rise of ISIS, and very little hope for the future. So this is the reality, and it's also, in a way, a very strange kind of fantastical way of how we as the international community look at it, because it can seem so far removed from us. I hope that, with images and photography, we can try to bridge that distance a little bit more. This boy was, his father was killed in a mortar attack, I believe, and he was injured and watched his father die. And, these were things that people were living through every single day. Does anybody have any questions? One back there. Sorry?
I have a question.
Okay.
My question to you is, are you afraid of these images? Because we don't really care about context that much anymore in this culture, that they're going to lose their power, their effect. Mm-hmm. Because without context, they have no meaning, basically.
That's a really good point. So a lot of the times I have to be very careful about the content of the photograph. If I show something that's too graphic, people will end up turning away. So in a way, I am creating a kind of fantasy of this is what, it's a reality, but it's just a portion of that reality. For example, this picture, it's only effective and powerful because of the people around the body. This was his mother grieving over, they were civilians. This was a student of English literature at university. He was killed while trying to help other people that were just injured in a mortar attack. And he was killed himself. But having, if I were to show the most graphic photographs, which is the real reality, I would never be able to communicate. It's so far removed from people, and also just too grotesque often to look at, that people would just end up turning away. So in a way, I have to compose things in a certain way for people to have a greater understanding of what's actually going on without turning them away. And there's it's just towing this kind of line and having a very keen sense of awareness of this balance that is really important in photography and photojournalism. And lastly, I'm moving onto some photographs about Iraq. I just got back 2 days ago, and I want to talk a little bit about aesthetics, just leading into that question, how it was different in Iraq because obviously it's not a fallout of the Arab Spring, but it's in terms of access to the front lines, to the civilian casualties, it was much more difficult because the Iraqi government wanted to control the numbers or announcements of numbers on how many dead or casualties in order to keep morale high. It was a lot less kind of Mad Max chaotic, running around doing whatever we wanted, but yet still a very, you could tell that there was this very underlying tension. It wasn't just about the war, but what is going to happen after the fall of ISIS in Mosul, which is the capital of the caliphate, as ISIS has proclaimed. So last month in October, the offensive, which was ramped up by the Iraqi army, Kurdish forces, which are predominant in that area, started fighting for the city of Mosul. There's about 1 million civilians in there, and ISIS is using a lot of people as human shields, preventing them from leaving the city, even though there's a lot of civilians are caught in the crossfire. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the creative process of this. Now, this was taken in a town called Gayara, which was where there's a lot of oil wells around the city. And ISIS, when it was actually kicked out just before the offensive, they set fire to these oil wells in order to cover, their tracks and try to prevent themselves from being easily detected as they were retreating further into Mosul. And until now, the oil wells are still burning. So it created this amazing kind of light, and I just thought that it was such an important aspect to cover because people were still living under this. A lot of people, the civilians who lived there, didn't actually leave the town. So they're living under this horrific cloud of oil and smoke and just terrible, terrible circumstances, even though they don't actually have active fire going on, as in they're not going to get shelled or, but it's a metaphorical kind of photograph because it also shows that in Iraq there's a lot of sectarian divisions. Amidst it all, there's also Christians and what have you, many, many different groups and branches from sects as well, the Shia and Sunni in particular. And what was very interesting about this photograph was that this boy, basically, he was very young, he was manning an outpost, and on the outpost they had a Shia flag. It was a flag of the Shia party, or actually Shia faith, but he was a Sunni himself, and he didn't have any bullets in his guns. So this is just one of the weird things of war, about where it's so bizarre, and he was made to put up the Shia flag to kind of show their presence in this neighborhood, and also he didn't have any bullets in his guns because none of the Sunni fighters were being paid. So a lot of it is a show, and yet a lot of it is not. These are men in the town actually lining up for oil. A lot of people didn't have fuel for their cars, and they had to wait in line for hours and hours in this mad rush of chaos to get oil. And also, in the same town, civilians had nothing to do. There were some services coming back, but they were still living under this cloud. And what I found really fascinating was that there was daily life going on. This girl was herding a flock of sheep. You can see their fleece have been blackened by the oil fires. And the same here, kids were playing in a stadium that was formerly, it was a soccer stadium, I believe, that ISIS had used to hide their weapons, and coalition or US airstrikes had actually destroyed the stadium, but kids still found a way to play in it. And everywhere around the city, kids were outside, they were flashing victory signs, they were playing, and they had been under control of ISIS for about 2 years. So they were still experiencing this kind of newfound freedom, even though pollution was terrible. And here's a boy walking near his home. I don't know if you can see, but the oil slicks all around have just created this apocalyptic situation. So with these images, there is a reality, again, like you were saying, but a reality that's just towing the line of what's acceptable in terms of portraying the situation to a public audience, reading newspapers or magazines. And also women walking through this town that has been heavily fought over. What's also interesting about what I photograph, a lot of times, it can be very one-sided. Here's the Middle East, it's in civil war, there's war everywhere. This is how, this is how we see a lot of what's going on in the Middle East. But at the same time, I find it really important to still portray what's going on a daily basis. People still laugh, they still have jokes, they still have family gatherings, they still have dinners and such. So, I am very aware that these photographs do only portray a kind of narrow reality, but we have to be mindful of the fact that there is still life going on, despite the terrible circumstances. So these men were actually, this town, it was called Hamam al-Alil. It was liberated 2 days earlier by the Iraqi forces from ISIS. So ISIS had retreated, and a lot of the men had shaved their beards and started swimming again in the thermal baths. And it was just this moment where, I was like, wow, this is amazing, because people are actually moving on. And they were all jumping into the pools and enjoying themselves in a way that was fresh and new. And this is a suspected ISIS fighter who was caught there was a checkpoint of civilians coming out of Mosul and going into the internally displaced persons camp, where they screened people and made sure, that their names weren't on a wanted list, for example. A lot of the images that we see coming out of Mosul is also civilians holding white flags. And what was one of the most poignant moments, actually, it was a difficult moment to capture, but when the women had reached these camps after fleeing from their homes, they unveiled themselves, and a lot of them just threw off their niqabs, which is the full face covering, and threw it onto the fence and just had this celebratory moment, which was, I think, more meaningful to me than any of the other things that were going on. Men in one of the camps, so for a lot of people, their lives are suddenly reduced to, depending on handouts and eating food separated from their families. And this was a man who was reunited with his brother, who was just arriving at the camp. There's a lot of camps set up outside of Mosul where civilians are being put for safety. And he hadn't seen his brother for about 10 days. Some families haven't seen each other for about 2 years, being separated. They had just come from ISIS-controlled territory. and they had just had this moment at the fence where they were both crying and very, very emotional. So again, the women coming off on the bus, a lot of them had already taken off their full face veils. And this is one of the realities of living in a camp. There's children everywhere, but they can still find moments of happiness and just wanting to play and being kids. And this was actually inside of the city of Mosul, where civilians were still living on the front lines. This elderly woman was pleading with an Iraqi soldier to give them food because they were experiencing food shortages. And I just found in the 2 previous wars where I'd lived, the front line was always evacuated of civilians, which is not the case in Iraq, simply because there's not enough space in the camps to house all the civilians from Mosul. And also, it was, there's a lot of political reasons why they wanted to keep civilians in there. And lastly, this was one of the injured boys that I had photographed near Mosul. One of the biggest consequences of this war is going to be unexploded ordnances and just bombs being left over. He and his brother had picked up some unexploded ordnance and were playing with it when it exploded, and they were both injured. And just to round up, so with these images, I hope that it can be some kind of conduit to the current events, because often they do feel very foreign to us. But bringing them back home in an aesthetic way, but without romanticizing a war, for example, I think is super important. And also there's 3 layers of fantasy in which apply to this kind of topic, which is 1, the subject of how they portray themselves, the reality that they're living in, their relative reality. The second being my own and how I interpret a situation or want to portray a situation. And thirdly, you, the audience, how you interpret the situation and how you interpret these pictures. So thank you very much for having me.